Hi everyone, and welcome to this panel session, which is all about how to get more from your cybersecurity spend. I'm your host, David Moth. I'm head of content at Panacea, and I'm joined today by three expert panelists. We have Thom Langford, who is CISO at DXC Technology. Hi, Tom.
Hello.
Heather Engel, managing partner at Strategic Cyber Partners. Hi, Heather.
Hi, David.
And Malcolm Harkins, who's Chief Security and Trust Officer at Epiphany Systems.
Hey, David.
Hi, guys. Good to meet you all. So to get right in, so security professionals are always under pressure, and the global economic situation is making things even more challenging for them. So to start with, I wanted to ask how tighter budgets and a lack of resources are affecting CISOs and their teams. And Heather, I'll come to you for that one first.
Thanks, David. Sure. One of the things that we're seeing across the board is these tighter budgets, lack of resources. Maybe we don't have the funding to hire enough people or to put tools in place, are really creating this fear of making mistakes as a CISO or someone who's working in security. And we're seeing a lot of stress. We're seeing a lot of burnout within the industry, obviously. There's definitely more things to keep us up at night because we feel like we don't have the resources in order to effectively manage our risk.
Sure. There's good points made there. And Tom, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think stress and burnout is probably the biggest one here. The industry is known for it anyway. With I think I heard something like 80% of CISOs who are stressed or extremely stressed in their roles at any given time. And I think if we overlook this, there's going to be a crisis of some kind. There's going to be a very human cost to some of these issues. Although we do, and I'm sure we're going to cover a lot of this in the rest of this conversation, we do have to put a lot of this into context, and we also have to, but on the flip side, we also have to make sure that we're providing, support and services and provisions for CISOs as an industry, not necessarily from our organizations, but as an industry and a community.
You're right, that mental health point, actually, there's a number of studies I've seen recently about the number of people leaving the industry and the difficulties in obviously getting people into the industry. So it's an important point to mention. I'll move on to our next question then, which is around cybersecurity budgets. And we just published a research report which found that on average budgets rose by 29% in the past year, which is obviously a healthy rise. But there was a feeling that budgets would need to go up by another 40% in order for security leaders to actually feel comfortable or confident that they can manage security risk. So I wanted to then throw it over to you, Malcolm, to find out sort of how can CISOs get maximum value from their existing security budgets?
Yeah, well, again, let's put this into context. The basically almost unchecked increase in spending and headcount that we've done year on year on year on cybersecurity is, if I put on my CFO hat, my CEO hat, and again, I'm a former finance person, I go, that's not a sustainable spend rate, particularly when the CISO goes in and says, yeah, but you can't hold me accountable to things, and risk is going to continue to grow. There are a lot of challenges that we have to deal with, but at the same time, we have to come to grips that we have to be more efficient and effective in what we're doing. And to some extent, that's because we've, frankly, in some areas, overspent and over-controlled. And in other areas, we've underspent and we've stayed behind the risk curve and haven't gotten up in front of it early enough. So I think, again, with some changes of perspective and changes of paradigm, we can do a much better job. But also, let's face it, relative to the last question, I don't know any general manager of any business unit that has all the resources, funding, and staff that they need. So we should also stop whining about our situation, because every business leader has that same challenge.
Yeah, I think there's probably webinars going on around the world at the moment in various industries talking about why the petrochemical industry doesn't have enough budget, and why why HR doesn't have enough budget, and we could do so much more, and blah blah blah. And I think, notwithstanding the last point about stress within security, etc., again, not a unique problem, but certainly a problem nonetheless. I think it's all too easy to say, if we had the money for it, I'd be a lot less stressed. You wouldn't. You'd have a whole bunch of other issues, whole bunch of other challenges. And frankly, and there's been research on this, an old friend and colleague of mine has done research on this about shelfware. You know, you're just going to go out and blow that money on a bunch of stuff that's not going to be used, and is just going to, you know, it's basically vanity purchases or purchases to maintain a budget. So, you know, there's never going to be enough money. Obviously, we have to make sure that there is some funding there, but you know, our budgets are going up, you know, quite dramatically at the moment, I think.
I would add too that this webinar is talking about how to do more with your existing security spend. And
Yes.
I would agree with both Thom and Malcolm that we have to really understand the data that we're trying to protect. You're not going to protect everything the same way. And not every single thing in the environment and the infrastructure is of critical importance where you need to be able to recover it within an hour or 2 hours. There are a lot of things within your infrastructure that have less critical data, maybe that could sustain a little bit of downtime. And so that's one of the things that is really important to remember. As we said, you're never going to have the resources to feel perfect and to feel like you've completely eliminated your security risk. So the important thing here is identifying the highest risk, putting a proportion of the budget to that. And for the rest of that, you know, you can assign assets and assign protection where it's available.
Yeah, and I think, you know, let's face it, most security professionals have probably come from an IT background where, you know, it's very binary. It either works or it doesn't work. And, you know, therefore, when we become security professionals, we want it to be perfect. We want everything to be exactly as it should be. What we're not good at as an industry, there has been improvements, but what we're not good at as an industry is understanding business and risk, you know, and actually appreciating that there are there's varying shades of gray here that we can work in that actually make much more sense from a business perspective.
Sure. And then just on to the next question then. So around, if people are overspending, what's the quick wins that we can have around getting more from security spend? And it was mentioned, you know, around they might have controls that they're not using, and they might have shelfware, which is, you know, just things that aren't being properly optimized. Is that somewhere that people can look, you know, they're looking for quick wins and somewhere they could perhaps target to reduce their spend or optimize it?
Yeah, I think people should look to deprecate controls that are inefficient and ineffective and start end-of-lifing them. You know, we've seen this before where, you know, for years on years on years, we'll leave the same control in place and not do the kind of weeding and feeding and get rid of ones that don't work and move to advanced technologies that give you more leverage. I think if you do that, that's an easy way to have a quick win. I think the other thing to do is think beyond your budget. I mean, when we spend $20 million on information security, the tail effect of that spend and the cost to others probably ends up being $100+ million. And so you can start looking and saying, how can I make other people more efficient by changing my controls? How can I change a control and speed up the business process? So I think when we think of budgets, we have to think way broader than just our security budget and way broader than just the IT budget and look at the entire business, to what Thom said. And I think when you do that, you can also then, to what Heather was talking about, really understand what could create a material impact, a material significant event for the business. Because at the end of the day, that's what the CEO and the board and the shareholders care about. They care about material events. And everything else is just operational risk. You don't want too much of it, but you really just need to make sure that you don't have a materially impacting event that could, you know, affect the shareholders or your customers.
Yeah, I think you know, for me, I think there's obviously quick wins. You know, you can cut out vendors that are duplicating your, you know, your services, things like that. But really, you need to make sure you're understanding the business. You need to make sure you're actually reading the company, you know, the company annual reports, for instance. You know, I ask in my talks, I often ask the audience who's read their annual company report on a regular basis. Maybe a third of people put their hands up. And if you don't understand what the business is there for, what it's doing, what its goal is, what its vision is. How can you, align your security services to that? Maybe you do need more budget and a gold-plated security function based upon your business need. Chances are you don't. There's very few companies that need that. Chances are actually you should be focusing on certain key areas that are really important to the business. Maybe they can survive. To Heather's point, maybe they can survive for a few weeks without having to run production or deliver service or whatever in specific areas, and therefore you can start to reallocate resources accordingly in line with the business objectives.
Right. Really, really great points here too. And I think sometimes we forget, because we work in this industry, that our infrastructure is here to support the business processes. Our infrastructure is here to make sure that the business can execute and function. There are not a whole lot of businesses that we work with, whose sole business is infrastructure. Maybe if you have an MSP or a cloud service provider or something like that, it might be a different situation. But if you're working in manufacturing, critical infrastructure, things like that, it's important to remember that the objective is to support the business and support the operational function. And I think Thom and Malcolm both covered that point really well.
Great. And then there's one topic I wanted to move on to, which was around consolidation, which is it's a topic I think Gartner's been speaking about for a while. I saw a report the other day that the number of the number of companies who are consolidating their vendors had gone from about 25% a few years ago up to 70 or 80% recently. And in our report that we published, we found that 86% of respondents were consolidating their security vendors. So I just wanted to ask, on that broader topic, to get your opinions on how consolidation can make security teams more efficient, enable them to do a bit more.
I mean, I think yes, absolutely. But I think what was old is new again, and what is new becomes old again. I think a lot of this stuff comes in cycles. Insourcing of your security function, then outsourcing your security function. Consolidating your security platform to go in best of breed for your security platform. I think it follows. There's technological improvements that might encourage us to go one way or the other, cloud functionality, etc., and those kinds of and the improvements in internet and connectivity, for instance, allows us to outsource more things. I think consolidation is a very important tool. I had the good fortune to interview the CEO of a very large San Francisco-based vendor. And they're all about consolidating onto a single platform because of the amount of in-depth analysis that they can do on their data lake of data, because everything goes into that single platform. But they're not stopping people from using other things as well. All it does is add to that data lake. But by moving onto that singular platform, you are saving a certain amount of money. You are putting it into one pane of glass, the ultimate thing for all CISOs, it would seem. But then again, you're losing best of breed. You're going for potentially average across the board rather than very, very specific, best of breed areas in endpoint, for instance, or SIEM or whatever. So there is always a balance to be had. What you need to decide is what's good enough to make sure that we are meeting our business objectives.
Yeah, I agree totally with Thom on that. And I don't think people should be chasing a number of vendors. That's a fool's errand. You need to have the right number of vendors to hit the cost envelope that you have to hit and the risk envelope that you have to hit. And if that says you have 100 security vendors, great. If it says that you have 10, that's fine too. And again, sometimes you can do damage when you consolidate, because when you consolidate, if you go sole source, you got a single point of failure, single point of compromise. And don't forget the fact that your security solutions also can be attacked. And so when you lack strategic diversity, you're also increasing risk. So you've got all these different things to play with, including purchasing power that on the one hand might get you a better price when you consolidate. On the other hand, you've now your vendor now has more control over you. So down the road, they can start, again, slowing features and increasing price and reducing your support. So always keeping some level of strategic diversity. And again, this coming from a former finance, a former procurement person, you have to, optimize these things in order to hit your business objectives.
And there's no one and done with this either. You're going to have to compromise a little anyway to reach that envelope, as Malcolm said. But also, you're going to put in your solution, whatever that is, maybe 80% on a single platform and 20% of other strategic vendors, etc. That's going to ebb and flow. That's not you done. You don't lose your hair like this for sitting back and just wait, doing nothing because you put in the ultimate solution. Businesses change, threats change, vendors change. Some vendors get slow and old, other vendors, get, new and improved. And you need to make sure that balance is kept correct. And if that means that you gradually move off a consolidated platform more or move more onto a consolidated platform, then that's fine. But it's not a one or two dimensional problem here. You've got to be tweaking and pulling the levers on this in the background on quite a regular basis.
One thing that I would add too is, when we talk about consolidation, and I think Malcolm mentioned this, that can give us some of that purchasing power to help us do more with our security spend. It also allows our staff, hopefully, to really get to intimately know those tools, make sure that they're fully using all the features, because I can't tell you how many clients I've worked with who have some tool. It's this great shiny new tool that the vendor sold them, and then they get it in the environment. And once the implementation is done, no one really knows how to use it. So one thing that we can do with consolidation, right, is we can allow our staff to get really comfortable and to get familiar with that tool and really take advantage of all the features. But I think both Malcolm and Thom made great points about some of those layered defenses. You don't want to be completely beholden to one vendor for all of your security. And again, thinking about where we need those best of breed tools. If we have one single tool, that's not going to be the best of breed for everything, every single thing.
Yeah, those are interesting points. And that chimes actually with the research that we did, because they found that it was around 80% of security leaders were worried that if they consolidate their tools, it reduces their ability to mitigate risk. So although it's, we found that it does help with things like procurement, actually, and making things a bit more efficient in that regard. Actually, there is a bit of a fear in terms of, are we actually going to weaken our security posture by accident by consolidating tools? So it sounds like, that fear might be somewhat justified from what you guys are saying there.
But there's nothing wrong with consolidation. I mean, and I think also, if we're looking at it from an enterprise perspective, 10, 20, 30,000 people or more in an organization, you're going to have significantly more flexibility in who you choose and how you consolidate versus the small to medium enterprises, the couple of thousand, a couple of hundred. You're going to have very few choices. You probably are going to go wholly consolidated at that lower end because you quite simply don't have the people. You're going to go consulted and outsourced, because that's the only way that you can manage your estate, which, let's face it, just because it's a small estate doesn't mean that the data is less important or less sensitive, the data you're protecting. So, there's nothing wrong with consolidation as such. It's just that you need to be aware of what you're doing and what your plan B is. And if you don't have a plan B, is that actually fine?
Yeah, and to just add on to what Thom said, and I mentioned this earlier, every business, I grew up in a manufacturing company at Intel, right? Strategic sourcing was in our DNA. Why? Because factories, you had materials, you had labor, you had service, you had chemicals, you had water, all these different things. So have a strategic sourcing plan and keep it up to date. And sometimes that'll say expand the supply base. Other times it'll say constrain it a little bit. But you have to be purposeful about why you're doing it and what you're getting out of it. And if you do that and do that right, and you do it routinely, it's not these spigots that get turned on and off like we typically do, that go in the whims of whatever sounds sexy in the marketplace. Consolidate. No, we got too many vendors. No, we need more. disregard the headlines. Do what you need to do to manage your business.
Yeah.
Cool. And then onto a sort of related topic around uses of technology. So around automation, which is, I was at a security event fairly recently, and it was, a topic which came up a lot. And I don't mean around, when people talk about using AI and they're not really using AI, I mean sort of more the automation side of things. So automating the kind of menial or repetitive tasks which make teams more efficient. So I wanted to get your guys' views on how you've seen automation already helping security teams become more efficient and enable them to do more with less.
Well, I think one way that we see this is when we're looking at, for example, a SIM tool, right? These are things that no human could do individually. And so the ability to refine and to use those tools in a way that automates sorting through the initial fluff, I think is absolutely critical. We see that in most tools. Most of our tool sets these days are going to have some sort of automation. That's the whole point of putting them in place. And so, obviously that can work for us, but it can also work against us if we haven't properly tuned the tool. Then we can start to miss events. And so we talked initially about understanding and classifying your data, understanding and classifying your risk. And so everyone's automation is going to be slightly different if we're talking about security tools, just to really help us understand, what are the things that we feel like are really critical? What are the things that we want to see as events? And that may be different than a competitor. It will definitely be different than someone in a different industry.
Yeah. And I think, go on, Malcolm.
Yeah, I was going to say, to add on to what Heather said, again, take this out of the security context. Why does anybody put automation in place? To scale, to provide labor efficiencies, new market opportunities, that type of stuff. We have to take the same approach. If we're understaffed by 5 or 10 people, is there automation that we can purchase that makes up for that staffing? Or if we've got a direction that we've got to cut and slow our headcount growth, what automation can be put in place? We have to be accountable to a business return on investment, like any automation should. And so don't just automate to automate with a purpose. And that purpose should be efficiency and effectiveness of what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, they always say on, when you go on a webinar or when you do things like this, is come out with a few sound bites. And so here's my first one, which is, attackers are attacking us at machine speed, and we're defending ourselves at the speed of Dave, our best intern in the SOC, who's only 19 and has only been in there for 3 weeks. And so, if the attackers are using automation to attack us, we can't even hope to address that with just pure humans. Our humans need a co-pilot who can actually use that automation to filter, to take through those billions of events that are coming through on a regular basis, and actually highlight to us the actual positives, the true positives to us, rather than just giving us a sea of data that we have to work through in order to find out if something's going on.
So then when you're looking at cases for where automation can help, it sounds like it's mainly around that data processing side of things that you're talking about, like managing events, doing the kind of triage and analysis, that kind of side of things. Is that where you're seeing it being most effective at the moment?
Yeah, I think that's the most obvious use case, just because of the sheer volume of data. Like I said, billions of events on a in some cases within a matter of hours. So yes, absolutely. I think we're seeing it elsewhere, and although we're moving into the territory of AI. So for instance, in the SOC again, but an EDR solution, an endpoint detection response solution, can actually go off and fix the problem on the endpoint. Without any kind of human involvement whatsoever. And it just tells you, I found this, it went wrong, I rolled it back, and everything's back to normal. So there's ways and means that we can use automation and AI in those kinds of scenarios.
I think you can also use automation too. One of the things that we haven't talked very much about is the human factor risk, right? The risk of the people that are within our security environment. So, another great example of automation would be if you are working through your onboarding or your offboarding processes, how do you automate that offboarding process? Because one of the things that we see the most is someone leaves the company and 6 days later or 2 weeks later or a month later, they still have an active account. They're still able to access things within the system. And those are other ways that you can use automation that don't necessarily have anything to do with the SIM or with log file management or any sort of automated security piece, but it is a very important piece of your overall sort of holistic security. And, I think Malcolm would probably agree there, because we've gone back a lot to the overall function and management of the business. How do we mitigate some of that human factor? And that's another way that we can use automation that's not necessarily security specific or focused on one, shiny new security tool.
I think that's a brilliant example, because from the human element, when we have new joiners, it's all very exciting and we all want to put our best foot forward and show them the best possible experience and get them access to everything. When people leave, very often it's a very negative feeling. Even if it's a good departure per se, it's a very negative thing. And so that spirit of, right, let's make this the best offboarding ever is never really there. Whereas with automated offboarding, none of that's a problem. It's just done for you. So I think it's a brilliant use case, where you remove that sort of human emotion side of things.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that first day office, last day office, but that also has to be highly integrated with the HR processes, has to be highly integrated in some cases with legal, some cases with the rest of IT. But if those are all joined together as one business process, inclusive of the security items, again, you gain a lot of efficiency there. David, to your point, beyond just the security operations side, I think there's a lot of automation possibilities in many other parts of what we do in the application security space, in the development space. There's a bunch of tools there, checking static code analysis and all that stuff, but there are, again, new advanced ways of doing that application security that are leveraging machine learning, making it more efficient and more effective, not only for the application developers, but for the security and compliance teams. I think in vulnerability prioritization, we've got to start working towards exploitability, understanding how our business is actually exploitable to a material event. And there's instrumentation automation there that, again, will lower risk and lower cost. So I think almost everywhere we look and everything we do, we've got to look towards advanced technologies and evaluate those versus what we've been doing today. And in pursuing those things, we'll find, again, return opportunities that lower our cost as well as lower our risk.
Yeah, that's a very good point, actually, around there's different elements that can be automated. And I wanted to come to, actually, Michael, on that point, I guess, with your background in procurement, you mentioned. So when you're looking at these different opportunities, and particularly when they involve other teams, like you mentioned, with the offboarding thing, you might be speaking to HR and legal and all these different teams. How do you begin to look at, okay, even if you sort of know this is going to make us more efficient, what's the process for proving that, particularly when you have to go and then deal with different teams who will have to be part of that efficient process?
Yeah, well, I think you have to start with looking at your data as it sits today. How many bodies, how many resources, how much am I spending from a total cost perspective? What's the drag coefficient this technology or this control is putting in place on others? And then you have to do pilots and POCs, and you have to experiment, and once you do that, you put together a business case and say, can I get a 97% reduction in my patching effort because I'm now focused on patching the things that are going to cause a material event to the business, rather than this spray and pray, patch everything, patch it now hysteria we get into when something like Log4j comes out and everybody full tilts one direction, pulling themselves through a knothole, creating a whole lot of churn, when in reality, if they had the right technology that understood the exploitability and understood the exposure, they knew that they only needed to deal with 50 instances of Log4j, the other 525, deal with it, a normal hygiene thing. But you know what? It's not going to kill you. there's no path to a real event, right? I think if we took more practical steps that way, and we're really truly data-driven in our business cases around risk and around efficiencies, we'd end up in a better spot.
That's right. Sorry, Tom, did you have a point on that one?
I was going to say, just, you can reprioritize that because it's not going to kill you today. It might kill you tomorrow or the day after, but right now, certainly in security, you have to deal with this stuff, especially with, threats being so fast moving. You have to deal with the stuff that's going to kill you today. And you have to identify those things because, otherwise, if you're off fixing the wrong stuff, you're here looking this way while, the criminal is creeping in like a cartoon bank robber on the left, on the other side of you.
Cool. Then just moving on to the final topic I wanted to cover was around regulations. So we're seeing a lot of new regulations coming out. There's the SEC proposals in the US and the new cybersecurity national strategy. And then in the EU, there's the DORA, which is mainly focused on financial services firms. But they're all basically bringing more scrutiny and more work for security teams to do to make sure they can prove they're complying with these regulations. So I wanted to just get your views then on how security leaders are going to deal with this increased scrutiny in the context of having less budget. Like, how do you comply with all these regulations and do the extra legwork when your budget's not where it needs to be?
Well, I can tell you, here in the US, we're also seeing a lot of regulations that are coming up around privacy, right? The EU has had GDPR for a while. We don't have we have more of a little bit of a patchwork in terms of privacy regulations. But, when you look at compliance, and I do a lot of work in this area with my clients, one of the things that consistently comes up is when you are starting to work through any sort of regulatory compliance, you have to put it in the context of not just checking boxes. You have to be able to say, what is the value of this? And do we have any flexibility in how we implement this? Most regulatory requirements are going to give you at least a little bit of flexibility. They're not going to tell you a product specific or require that you have a SIM. They're not going to typically require that there's automation. Sometimes we'll see that, but generally you have a little bit of flexibility in how you put that in place. And so the really, really critical thing to remember here is looking at your overall risk and then saying, how does this compliance or regulatory requirement, what is this going to do for me to reduce my overall risk? I don't want to spend money. I don't want to put resources or energy into just checking a box. Even in a lot of cases with regulatory requirements, we see so much that's required in the way of documentation, right? And any security professional will tell you they know that they need to do their documentation, but it's so far down on the list of things that they have to do on a day-to-day basis that it really falls by the wayside. And so again, looking at how you document what you've done so that you can satisfy the auditors or satisfy the regulators, but doing it in a way that then your documentation doesn't become so bloated that no one ever looks at it. I used to work for some government agencies, and there were times when I would sit there and I would be writing this piece of documentation. It was a couple hundred pages, and I was almost tempted to slip in some little Easter eggs because I knew no one was ever going to read it, and I thought, I wonder if I put this in here, how many years or if ever someone would ever find it. And so I think when we talk about regulatory compliance, it's absolutely critical to know what you are responsible for. What are the legal implications that could come back on you if you don't do this? What do you have to do to put this in place to satisfy an auditor? But also remembering that these things are intended, for the most part, to help you protect your data, to give you a framework around reducing your risk, and look at it in a very pragmatic way. We're not just checking a box. We need this to be part of our overall security resource plan. And how does that security resource plan, Malcolm, this is for you, how does that fit into our overall business operations?
Yeah, I 1,000% agree with you, Heather. I think, the one thing I've learned over the years, if you start with compliance, you won't end up with security. Mm-hmm. But if you have the right security and risk management approach, the byproduct, the residual will be compliance. You might have to do a little bit of cleanup, but if you have a good security and risk management prioritization approach to things, by and large, you should end up being pretty darn close to being compliant. And at the end of the day, I'd rather be not compliant and be able to defend myself that I made the right risk decision for the right reasons with the right spending than to be compliant and risk my business and risk my customers.
Yeah, I want to build on Malcolm's point there with, maybe a little sort of practical advice, which is for me, choose a standard or whatever. Personally, I'm a fan of ISO 27001. It's global. It's non-specific. I mean, one thing that people very rarely understand is that you can actually become ISO 27001 certified without owning a single computer in your organization. So it's not a pure technology certification. It's a security certification. What you'll find is the amount of harmony between ISO and any other regulation there is very high percent, 80+%. And, to Malcolm's point, if you've made good security risk-based decisions, you're going to, excuse the phrase, tick the compliance boxes much more easily and with a lot of evidence already created for your other certification than you would otherwise. Because, you as Malcolm says, security can lead to compliance. Compliance will rarely lead to security. The other thing I'd say is, and GDPR is a great example of this, GDPR is a legal framework. It's based around laws for the European Union. I know the UK is going to be adopting their own, but based upon GDPR. It's a legal framework. So take your general counsel out for lunch. Be very clear with them about where the responsibilities lie and how you're going to work together. Because in a lot of instances, GDPR gets thrown over the fence at security. And there's a lot of legal language in here and potentially some conflicts of interest as well. So security is about securing the data, the CIA triangle, et cetera, et cetera. GDPR and privacy, for instance, is about securing the interests of the individual. And the two may be completely different.
I would also add too, and Thom, this is a great segue into what I was going to say, which is that if you are in an organization where you are really struggling to get any sort of resources or any sort of support from your CEO or your CFO or the board of directors, this can be a really great way to convince them that we need some more investment in our security spend. And particularly for organizations where the CEO is kind of hands off or they haven't shown a real interest in pursuing security, and we really can show that there's a tangible risk, right? Especially if we're talking about some sort of regulatory framework that could find us with fines or fees or the inability to conduct business. This can be a really great way for us to work on improving the security spend and to get the attention of the board of directors, to get the attention of that CFO so that you can improve your security budget. Now, if you're going to use this to do that, again, to Malcolm's point, and I think Thom mentioned this as well, you have to be able to show the return on investment. You have to be able to show how you're going to efficiently use that spend. This isn't just a blank check for us to go buy the latest shiny vendor tool. Here's what we're going to do to get from point A to point B. This is our plan of action to get from non-compliant to 80% compliant, eventually to 100. So I would say that that's another tool in the arsenal, right, for getting the most out of your security spend. If you have to do compliance, if you have to do something regulatory, make sure you understand what the financial implications are. And that can really help you in getting the support of your executive leadership team if you don't already have it.
Yeah, and here's completely. And here's my next soundbite, which is explaining to the board for them what the ROI is, the risk of incarceration of them not doing something. That sometimes will often bring about a slight sort of mood change within the room of actually you as the board are now personally liable in certain circumstances if we don't do certain things or if something happens because we haven't done something.
And we as CISOs also need to be personally liable, equal to them,
Recent events have proven that.
Yeah, regardless of whether or not we're a corporate officer or director, we need to take that personal accountability and embrace it with that level of, I'm accountable for it. You can't just put on your Teflon skin and say the board accepted the risk or I didn't get the money. If that's the problem and it's a material risk, then you walk all the way up to the board, you put it on their lap and say, hell no, not under my watch. This is unacceptable. And live with the consequences.
Yeah, we're certainly seeing, as you say, a lot of the new regulations, the outcome of them is that accountability for cybersecurity is being moved up, basically. So it's the board, as you say, who are going to be on the hook for it ultimately. So they need to know more about what's going on. Just to marry up a couple of the topics that we've been talking about. So we talked about automation and then sort of these new regulations that are coming in. Is there more scope in terms of the data collection and all the documentation side of things to use more automation on that side of things so that people aren't spending lots of time on that data collection side, as you say, just to prove compliance when they should be trying to keep businesses secure?
Well, I do think there can be, but, let's keep it simple. In some cases, did you make an appropriate decision? Yes. Okay. Well, write meeting minutes. Did I respond to an event appropriately? Okay. Document the event, write meeting minutes. I don't need a lot of automation. I've already got emails, right? So in some cases, don't over rotate on the automation for what will demonstrate you're compliant, which is, did I make a good decision and did I do what I said I was going to do?
Yeah, I would add too, I feel like when I work with clients, one of the tools that companies invest in that costs them the most money, that they seem to get the least value out of, is some sort of GRC documentation tool. If you're going to put something like that in place, you have to understand the level of employee engagement. Very often, if you're going to have a tool like that, it requires a whole entire person or team to maintain it. So I don't know that you're necessarily gaining efficiencies for some of those small to medium-sized businesses. On the enterprise side, yes, that may be an appropriate way to go. But as far as automation goes, we have email, we have different tools within our chat functions and things like that. Just make sure that you know where those things are. Meeting minutes is one of my favorite ways to show that we have assessed the risk and we've made a decision and that everybody has agreed on it. If you're talking about writing security plans and policies and documentation and things like that, those things are important, but it's also important to remember that if the IT team or the security team is writing that in a bubble and I'm writing a policy, but I never share it with anybody or I never train anybody on it, it's like if a tree falls in the woods, does it even really exist? You've written it, but you haven't distributed it and made sure that the people in your organization are aware of what you're trying to do and what kind of rules you're trying to implement from a security behavioral standpoint. I don't think that's going to be really helpful. So it's important to me not to overthink that. And it doesn't have to be perfectly organized. It does need to be there if you're going to show it to an auditor. But the other thing that I tell people is if I'm getting ready for an audit, if I can pull something together in under 5 minutes and show it to an auditor, do I need to keep a copy of it somewhere, right? If I can go into my tool and I can run a report that's almost real time, that shows the way things are configured, that shows, our log history, or that if I can generate a network diagram or an asset list in under 5 minutes when I'm preparing for an audit, do I need to keep that in real time? Probably not.
Cool. Thanks, guys. Just to finish then, because I think we're sort of getting up against time, but just sort of almost a quick fire answer from all of you would be great. Just on the point that we've heard that security budgets perhaps aren't growing at the rate that people would like them to. So where do you think that security leaders should be prioritizing their investment over the next sort of, say, 2 years? And Heather, I'll come to you first on that one.
Oh, you get to me first. Well, so there's one thing that I would add to as far as getting the most out of your security spend. And again, this may not be appropriate for enterprise level businesses, but if you're talking about a small to medium sized business, we all know that in IT security, you can't be an expert in everything. And so one of the areas that you could potentially look at is some sort of a fractional CISO, a part-time person to come in and assist with areas of expertise that your team might not have. And a great example of this is, for example, incident response or forensics. There's very few organizations in the small to medium-sized space that are going to be able to prioritize having some sort of threat assessment team or having a forensics person on staff to respond to IR. Enterprise side, yes, that might be something that's worthwhile and necessary. But in the small to medium environment, one of the ways we can get a little bit more out of our security spend is looking at bringing on someone who's part-time or who has an area of expertise that we don't necessarily have in-house. So that would be my wrap-up, my wrap-up comment there.
Cool, thanks, Heather. Malcolm, would you like to go next?
Yeah, again, if I look at this like a profit and loss, like a business, I would look at what would be the equivalent of our cost of goods sold, and what is the thing that's driving the vast majority of our budget, right? And a lot of that ends up being, and again, total cost, IT and the business, patching, vulnerability management, risk assessments, all that stuff. And I would try and figure out how to, again, leverage automation to be more precise and prescriptive so that I can lower those costs, not patch as much, patch where I need to, move from vulnerability management to exploitability management. There's huge leverage in that for cost reduction and for risk reduction. I think those things will give you the most bang for the buck in the short term. But again, we also have to look at where we need to invest. There's other risks on the horizon that we're seeing right now with machine learning and artificial intelligence, not just using it for security, but those areas that the business is adopting, we're getting, embedded with other solutions. Those aren't protected. There's things below the operating system that aren't protected. So while we're shrinking in some areas for efficiency, we have to invest in forward thinking about the risks that are going to bite me in the ass 10 months from now to 10 years from now. And if we don't do that, we're going to be on the same perspective we have today. We're always going to be on our heels complaining about the situation rather than innovating our way out of it.
Completely. Thanks, Malcolm. And Thom, do you want to wrap us up?
Yeah, certainly. I think it's very difficult for me to say what an individual security team should be prioritizing over the next year or two. But what I think they can do is, or what I can do is describe how you can identify what you need to prioritize on. And I think part of that is basically stop all your expenditure right now. Start talking to your vendors to find out what it is you've actually got, what's in use, what you've got licenses for, what you don't have licenses for, what you're using, what you're not using, etc. Because they'll give you the honest view. If you go around to your team, you're going to have some emotional investment in certain tools or decisions that may have been made in the past, prior to your tenure. But then once you've got this picture from all of your vendors as to what's in play at the moment, you can then see for yourself where the overlaps are, where the redundancy is, etc. And then you can start to trim, chop and change and reprioritize investment from one vendor or one area to another.
Fantastic. Thanks, Thom. And thanks very much, guys, for everything you've shared with us today. It's been really insightful. And thank you to everyone who's taken the time to join us. I believe the report that I've mentioned is available to download by clicking on one of the links. And yeah, thanks very much for joining us, and I hope to see you soon.